Welcome to the KidMin podcast with Dr. Val and Dr. Virginia, where we talk about everything KidMin
and pull back the curtain on some of the surprises and challenges in children's ministry that nobody prepares you for.
I'm Dr. Val, and together we have over 45 years of experience in children's ministry.
I'm Dr. Virginia. Valerie and I met over 10 years ago in our doctoral program at Southeastern Baptist Theological Seminary. We are excited to share with you all the great stuff that we have picked up over the years. We want to minister to you, the children's minister.
Welcome, friends. Thank you so much for being with us today. I am super excited to be talking with Kayla Smith. You have heard her on our podcast before. We've talked about some other things with her, and we are going to be talking about trauma-informed children's ministry today. And I am super excited. We are missing Dr. Virginia. We had some technical difficulty, and so she is not with us in the conversation, but she is in our hearts. She's always with us, which is just not with us physically today. But Kayla, I'm super excited. For anyone that maybe didn't hear our first episode with you, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, where you're from, your background, that kind of thing?
Sure. So I'm Kayla Smith, and I live in the Nashville, Tennessee area. I serve as Pastor of Intergenerational Discipleship at Trevecca Community Church of the Nazarene. I'm an ordained elder in the church, and I've served as a children's pastor full-time. I've been a teacher. I've been in higher education for a while. And I grew up in Alabama, between Alabama and Georgia, came to Tennessee for school, and other than a couple of years in Florida, have been here ever since.
Right.
I love kids ministry. I love discipleship with kids. Let's see, I love a good podcast and I love a good book. I love listening to NPR and always love a good cup of coffee.
All right. Well, tell us a little bit about how you got started with trauma-informed children's ministry.
Yeah, so I grew up with a sense of trauma-informed practices, other names for it, but I grew up with a sense of that because my dad is a behavior interventionist. He has worked with kids from hard backgrounds for my whole life, and so I was really familiar with the language of caring for kids from hard places. I didn't know how much that permeated my ministry, though, until there was a research study that came up. The Church of the Nazarene is a pretty small denomination comparatively to other denominations. And so Dr. Robert Crosby from California Baptist was conducting a research study of children's ministries and got in touch with the Church of the Nazarene, sent out a survey to all of the kids pastors that they had contact information for. So just a random Sunday, I gave this survey to my kids. I filled out a survey myself. We mailed them in, and I thought that was the end of it. But Dr. Crosby reached back out to me and said that the results of our church's kids were interesting. They were experiencing a deeper level of connection to the church and to God and to one another than would typically be seen for their age groups and genders. Our boys in particular were feeling very connected to God and to one another and to the church. And so he just wanted to do further research on this. And so he starts talking about trauma-informed ministry. At that time, I was not super familiar with the term, but as I looked it up, I was like, this is what I believe in. This is exactly what I love. He came out and did a site visit and interviewed our kids, and has developed since then academic journals and all of the stuff that most of us are not really going to read a lot of unless you just really love academic journals. I really don't know that you're going to get that in front of you. So he and his wife Lori, who is a play therapist, they wrote a book on all of the stories that came from the research. I was privileged to be able to read this book as they wrote it and really loved partnering with them in just think tanking all of the pieces of the book.
Right.
And then a few years ago, Robert reached out to me to ask. He said, I've got a crazy idea and I don't know that I want to do it if you don't want to join me on it. But what if we were to take the research and put it into language that our churches, particularly our volunteers, will have access to? So we developed the Reach Hurting Kids Workshop, launched the Reach Hurting Kids Institute, and it's been an absolute whirlwind and an absolute dream ever since. It has been a privilege to work in this field.
Oh, that's awesome.
Yeah.
Well, and I think it's just so timely for us,
Yeah.
just because we're finding, and I know that I think one of the greatest questions that we tend to get in children's ministry, as we've done conferences and as we've talked with people, tends to be, what do we do when we have children with big behaviors in our classrooms? What do we do to help our families when the children are going through crisis? What do we do? How do we handle discipline in a church setting, in a classroom?
Right.
And so I think that so much of what you all speak about, and what you teach and what you help leaders do, is to be able to process, how can we minister to children better, realizing that there is always something behind a big behavior. It's not just the
Mm,
big behavior. And
yeah.
so what are some of the things that you have found to be helpful for children's ministers as
Mm,
they help their volunteers, as they help their families
yeah.
work with children that are in crisis or that are struggling with things?
Yeah, yeah. I think you hit on this just a minute ago. The most important thing is to reframe the way we see behavior.
Mhm.
Behavior is communication. Every piece of behavior is communicating something on a deeper level.
Mhm.
So if we learn to respond to the deeper need rather than react to the behavior in front of us, that can change so much of the way we process these big behaviors at church, at
Mhm.
home, at school, wherever you land. I think another piece that's really important that helps kids through this is that we intentionally create space for them to belong. We
Mhm.
give them autonomy where possible. We respect them as individuals. We respect them in a way that says, you are so capable. You are so worthy of my love and attention, of God's love and attention,
Mhm.
that you can make your own choices,
Mhm.
that you can have your own dignity in this conversation, in this space, in this moment, even when your behavior is kind of out of hand.
Mhm.
Um, Reframing our mindset is what we have control over. We don't
Right.
have control over the big behavior.
Right. Right.
So when we can step back and say, what can I control? What can I do? I
Mhm.
can train myself to respond with compassion, with empathy, with a sense of integrity for them, of
Mhm.
you can do this. You can handle this. We can make it through this moment, and you will still belong just as much as you did before this big behavior.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that so many teachers, or especially with volunteers, because they don't have the educational background necessarily.
Yeah.
They're not necessarily teachers by
Right.
by vocation, and so they come into the classroom and they feel this need to somehow have a dominance, to somehow take
Mm,
control, to
yeah.
somehow try to force
Yeah.
children into things. And so I think that it's hard sometimes for adults to realize that it's not necessarily them,
Yeah.
because they don't have control of that moment,
Right.
and they have to look at this bigger picture.
Mhm.
How can our children's ministers better help our volunteers that don't have that kind of experience and background, to be
Mhm.
able to take that step back, to think about the big picture, as opposed to just sort of handling it with the emotion that a lot of adults will just immediately try to control and handle with?
Yeah, yeah. One of the things we talk about in our discipline module is to take a deep breath, to regulate yourself, right? Take a moment to step back and name your emotion, and then come back to it when you're in a more calm space.
Mhm.
This could take 5 seconds. It could take just a moment to just
Right.
recognize where you're at before speaking first. We have a whole set of workshops. We've got 4
Mhm.
modules on trauma-informed ministry that are built for your church, for anyone's church, to lead your team of volunteers through so that they can
Mhm.
become trauma-informed.
Mhm.
You would have access to these workshops indefinitely, once you've used them, so that you can brush up with your team with a new set of volunteers. And it's geared for volunteers. It's geared to train volunteers in an approachable way so that we
Mhm.
can all speak the same language. We can all
Right.
work with kids from the same mindset. So if that's of interest to you, it's
Mhm.
reachhurtingkids.com/workshop. And that will take you straight to where that trauma informed workshop would be.
Mhm.
So beyond that, one of the things that we teach as well is that we need to focus in on the implicit gospel. teaching the gospel, teaching children the good news of Jesus is so important. And we want to preach the gospel to them with our words, but we need to recognize that our actions, our behaviors towards children teach them so much more about the love of God.
Right.
So teaching our volunteers to evaluate the moment, if in this moment, what we're supposed to be doing is teaching them the gospel. So doggone it, you're going to sit down and learn the gospel. Like,
Right.
I don't know that that's really getting the message across the way that you intend.
Right.
So if we just keep in mind that implicit gospel, our actions towards children will teach them so much more about the love of God
Right.
than any of our words ever would.
Right.
So use your heart, use your actions to teach them. Rather, maybe we can shift that to help them experience the love of God,
Right.
rather than it being an intellectual exercise. Yeah.
Right. Right. Well, in children's ministry, we have a billion things that we're trying to do all at one time. And there's so many responsibilities that we have, and
Yeah.
time is such a constraint. Do you have
Mhm.
any recommendations for how you have found to fit this type of training into your
Mm.
schedule?
Yeah.
How have you encouraged your volunteers to
Yeah.
be a part of this type of training?
Right.
Because so many times it can be so difficult to even get our
To get
volunteers to
everyone in
come
the same
in for
room.
training. Yeah.
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 Yeah, it can be really hard. I think a good part of it is to preface it, to talk about it often when
Mhm.
you see your volunteers. So on a Wednesday night, on a Sunday morning, you consistently talk about, "Hey, we've got this training coming up. I know you've been dealing with this situation with this kid, or I know you've got this situation coming up. This will give you incredible tools to be able to help with that."
Mhm.
Just to be honest about, we want to have the same vocabulary, we want to have the same mindset, so please, please, please make sure you come. The best time that I've found in training our church as volunteers is to do a right after church on Sunday. Provide a
Right.
meal. This is a 90-minute or 75-minute training.
Right.
We call it 90 minutes to add a meal in the front of it.
Oh, yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah, just stay for an hour and a half. We will get through this training together. And what I found is that regardless of when our training is, we've done Saturday mornings and Sunday afternoons. Those who have been able to attend stay for a while to talk about specific situations after we're done with the official training.
Right.
We train on a 3-month cycle. So every 3 months, we have another
Mhm.
training day. And with 4 modules, that gets you through them in a year.
Mhm.
But we come back to them to refresh. We come back to say, what is happening now that we
Mhm.
need to address? The children's pastor and I have just talked about having a case study Saturday where everybody can come in with an idea of like, all right, this kid is doing this thing and I don't know what to do with this
Right.
situation anymore. Um, we need that kind of safe space to do it. So
Right.
recognizing that we just don't have unlimited time. I mean, our
Mhm.
volunteers in particular are
Yeah.
giving of their time for these kids. We've tried to keep our modules short and to the point with a lot of discussion so that it can be worthwhile for
Right.
them to stay and to learn to speak the same vocabulary for the sake of the kids.
Right. Right. Well, and I think that this is something that the great thing about this particular training too is that it's so practical because,
Mm,
like I said, so many of the volunteers are really struggling with how
right.
do we handle these situations and what
Yeah,
can we do? And so it's really, practical hands-on things that they can do, and it's going to be really
exactly.
helpful for them, I think.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, that's really important to us that we make something that you can use tomorrow. I mean, we
Mhm.
don't want, as much as
Right.
theory is so important, there's so much else to learn about trauma-informed practices, about how a brain works and neuroplasticity and all that. It's all
Right.
fascinating, and I
Oh, yeah.
definitely would love to have that conversation with anyone who wants to have it, but we
Right.
don't have unlimited time.
Right.
So we get down to the nuts and bolts of here is what you can do. Here are some practices you can put in place right now that will
Right.
help your kids at church.
Right. Well, I think that we have so much going on just in our world today, and so much with social media and things that are happening in the news. And it's so very difficult, I think, for adults to be able to handle it because there's moments where I feel like I am just overwhelmed hearing it makes me stressed and it makes
Yeah,
me anxious to hear all of the things that we're hearing and see all the things that we're seeing. And
right,
so how much more it affects our kids, it's just
right.
huge. And
Yeah,
so finding ways that we can can help them to be able to process, but to see God's love and to see
Mm,
God's movement in our world, and to be able to connect them in that way is huge. And so I think finding the ways that we can do that in a classroom successfully, any kind of help that we can get in that way.
absolutely.
So, there's so much in the world that we're seeing, we're processing, we're trying to handle all of these things that are such big issues in our world. And one of the things that I've been learning, especially over these last few years, because for me, when I always heard the word trauma, I always thought this is something huge. This is seeing someone pass away in front of me, or dealing
Mm,
with violent crime, or having these huge events. But I've been learning over the last few years that trauma affects people in different ways. And
yeah.
so when you are talking about trauma informed children's ministry, when you're talking about trauma, what exactly do you define as trauma, and how do you
Mm.
explain that?
Yeah, that's a great question. I think we really need to reframe trauma into a bigger category. Honestly, all of us have gone through some level of trauma because all of us have been around during this season of COVID and
Right.
shutdowns and so much death and so much confusion and all of that. That's a trauma that our
Mhm.
kids have gone through. At the time that Robert and Lori wrote their book, they talked about ACEs, so the adverse childhood experiences, and those include things like drug and alcohol abuse in the home, domestic violence, divorce of parents, of course, physical, emotional, sexual abuse. All of these things count as adverse childhood experiences.
Mhm.
And at the time they wrote their book, 4 out of 6 kids will have experienced at least one of those by the time they
Mm.
graduate from high school.
Right.
And 1 out of 6 would be experiencing 4 or more of those by that same timeline.
Yeah.
The statistics mean that you certainly have children in your church who have experienced trauma.
Right.
And trauma affects the way our brains process information. Trauma affects everything about our lives. It affects our behavior. It affects our self image. It affects everything. And so, if we can come at the world realizing that trauma doesn't necessarily mean they've gone through a tornado. Certainly that is traumatic, but
Right.
trauma is not something that has to be so big. It can be as simple as their parents divorced. It could be
Right.
as simple as COVID was really scary and I didn't
Mm.
understand it. And this affects the way that they process their world. So, if we
Right.
understand that in the church, if we approach church with a trauma informed mindset, what that means is that we are choosing that we will do the work of tearing down the barriers between hurting kids and the
Mhm.
love of Christ.
Right.
We will do what we can to extend the love of Jesus even in the midst of their pain.
Right.
I cannot imagine that there would be a church out there that would not want to do that, would not want to equip themselves to love kids with everything they've got, whether or not they've experienced big trauma.
Right. Right.
Yeah.
Well, and I think something that we need to remember too is that I love how you talked about how trauma affects so many things.
Mhm.
And the way that it affects our brain, and the way that it changes the way we process things, but it can also have physical effects, and it
Yeah.
has the emotional effects. And so it's very complicated, but it's
Mhm.
also this big picture.
Yeah.
And so many times and I've had it's funny because I'll have volunteers ask me questions sometimes in conferences, like, for example, they'll say, maybe I have a child with dyslexia. How can
Mhm.
I help teach them, to write their B's and D's correctly?
Mhm. Mhm.
And I always have to kind of take that step back and say, what the great thing is, that that's not your responsibility. Your
Yeah.
responsibility is not to fix that.
Right.
And I
Right.
think that we tend to try to do that as well with trauma, in that we want to
Mhm.
try to fix things.
Right.
And so I like the way that you were talking about that what we're doing is that we're teaching them about the love of God.
Mhm.
We're not trying to fix something.
Yeah.
We are not equipped to be able to handle
Right.
fixing that. How do you work
Mhm.
with volunteers to help them see that they have this one piece of what they're
Mhm.
doing to try to help these children, but they don't have to necessarily be trying to fix their entire situation? Does that make sense? Am
Sure.
I?
Yeah. Yeah. I think one of the important pieces we talk about is that we get questions all the time about, how do I know if the kids in my church have experienced trauma? And the truth is, most of the time you're just not going to know.
Right.
That's not for you to know. And of course, if there's something that you do know is happening, if you're recognizing some signs and symptoms that indicate something that needs to be reported, of course, please report. But
Right.
even in that case, we are not therapists. We are not
Mhm.
doctors. We are not the ones that can step in and heal this mental health. I mean, even on that level, we are not the savior.
Right.
We are not here to heal this.
Right.
But what we do know is the love of God. And
Mhm.
we can extend the love of God to them, whether or not we know about their trauma. What we
Right.
can do, what we do have control over, is training ourselves to love them well, training ourselves to respond well. And the matter of fact is, like, we don't know which kids have experienced trauma, but honestly, every single kid benefits from a point of view that says, I recognize that whatever's going on right now has
Mhm.
way more to do with what's happening under the surface than it does with the behavior that I'm seeing. So
Right.
I will choose to respond in grace, to coach you as you come along in the faith, and
Mhm.
to give you all of the dignity in the world to experience the love of God. You are not less than because you have behaved poorly. You are not excluded because we don't know how to handle your big outbursts. You
Right.
belong in the family of God, and we will figure this out together. That's worth it for every kid, trauma or no.
Right. Well, it is, and it's that accepting a child not because of how they behave or how they dress or any of those things.
Right.
It's loving a child because they have been created by God and they are part of your church family and they are part of what you've been called of, of how you've been called to serve.
Mhm.
And so, but it's so easy. It always makes me so sad when I hear stories of like a parent bringing a child into a classroom and the teacher responding in a like, "Oh, no,"
Mm.
kind of way
Oh,
when they
yeah.
see a child
Yeah.
coming because
Right.
because the children pick up on all of this so
Of
very
course.
readily, and they know when
Right.
they're accepted and when they're not, and
Yeah.
so it's that idea of realizing that this is not about you, this
Mm.
is about
Mhm.
what they're going through and how can we meet them where they are.
Yeah. Yeah, and meeting them with where they are is a privilege. Like, what a
Mhm.
gift to be able to meet them. In one of our modules, we talk about discipline and
Mhm.
how often we will see discipline as this obstacle to ministry. Like, "Ugh, I can't preach my sermon now because I'm going to have to deal with this behavior outburst,"
Right.
or "We're not going to be able to sing this song because I'm having to chase this child down the hallway
Yeah.
to make sure that they stay safe," which may or may not have just happened on Sunday. It's fine.
It's all
Um,
it's all good, it's all
but
good.
do we see it? Do we see it as an obstacle to the ministry that's actually supposed to be happening?
Mhm.
Or do we reframe and say, this is an opportunity?
Right.
This is an opportunity to coach this child, to disciple this child, to love them well, and to say,
Mhm.
hey, you belong. You belong regardless. You belong, big feelings and all. And
Mhm.
sometimes that leads to a disclosure of like what's actually happening under the surface, what pain they're
Mhm.
experiencing, or isolation, or fear, or whatever it is that's happening. And would it not be the response of Jesus himself to say,
Mhm.
I see your pain
Mhm.
and I am sitting here with you in it. I
Mhm.
see that you ran,
Yeah.
but that doesn't mean that you're away from me. That means
Right.
that I will come with you.
Right.
And I will sit with you in this fear, and I
Mhm.
will walk you through this fear into the kingdom of heaven. We believe that the kingdom of heaven is here among us now in little tiny glimpses, right? And the church
Mhm.
serves as a beacon of the kingdom of heaven. And if that's true, if we believe that, then
Right.
everyone belongs.
Right.
Everyone belongs. You
Right.
don't, I mean, you can bring your big feelings, you can bring your fear and your
Mhm.
anxiety and your dysregulation and your hurts, everything. And
Right.
there is not a barrier to the kingdom of heaven because God loves you that much.
Kayla, can you give us some examples of situations in ministry where the resources from the trauma informed ministry has been really helpful and how you have ministered to children through some of what you have
Mm.
learned and what your research has taught you?
Yeah, of course, like with any examples of children's ministry, we changed names and
Right.
and details in order to protect the privacy of the church and the children. But there was a situation a few years back where we had a little girl who was just struggling all day long. She ran from caretakers. She like laughed about behaviors that were not acceptable. Like she just was struggling that morning. Well, we happened to know that her family was going through a pretty serious transition. Her family experiences poverty on a level that a lot of our church members don't understand. There were new members of their household that were, it's just disruptive to their whole family system. So she was just struggling. And we had a particular volunteer with her that day who ended up having to chase her through the building and sit with her in the hall and just process some of this. She received, the volunteer received the brunt end of a lot of this girl's trauma that day. Right. And so understandably, by the end of the day, she has done her very best to use all of the strategies she's learned about trauma-informed practices and to listen and to be responsive and to not be judgmental, to just really work hard at coaching this student. But by the end of the day, she's understandably frazzled. She's just done. And so she's going to her car at the end of the day, and our friend is getting on the church van to go home. And the girl kept like hovering around like the pastors and just, hey, I need to talk to you. Hey, I have a question. Hey, I have a question, the whole time. And of course the pastors are like, okay, we're trying to say goodbye to everybody. You've got to get on the van. And she finally gets the attention of one of the pastors, and they're trying to be patient and say, okay, what? And she says, what is that thing you keep telling us? You tell us every week. You tell us every week, no matter what. What do you tell us? And the pastor's trying to think through, like, what are you talking about? And every week in our kids ministry at the time, we repeat, God is always with you. And she finally lands on it. Something about God is with me. And the pastor is able to say, like, yes. Okay, yes, God is always with you. Yes, God is with you. And she looks over across the parking lot at this volunteer who has helped her all day long. Hey, yo, God is with you. And when that happened, then this volunteer is able to turn around and say, like, oh, and God is with you too. It is the teeny tiny little moments like that, the nuggets of the kingdom of heaven, where we see this work is hard, and it is exhausting, and it is so worth it. It is so worth it. So this volunteer who has just poured her heart out for this student knows they're listening. And they know, they don't only know that God is with them, but they want to proclaim that for someone else.
Right.
So all of the hard and all of the chaos and all of the crazy is worth it for the moment of, hey, yo, God is with you. Man. Yeah, that's just one. I mean, we've got so many beautiful stories from across the nation of people who have shared with us when we have used these practices, when we have really dug into understanding how to remove the barriers between kids who are hurting and the love of Jesus Christ. When we've leaned into this, it's not that it's suddenly easy. It's not that it's everything is just sparkles and cupcakes after that. No, that's not it. It's going to be hard. It's going to be hard. But man, those beautiful moments where we're able to see the love of God transcends all. The love of God breaks down all barriers and chases them down to say, God is with you. And you get to tell that to the people that you struggle with as well. So, there are countless stories. We just talked as a team yesterday about a project we'd love to do of sharing some of those stories safely with name changes and stuff like that. Because man, don't we all need encouragement when things are hard?
We really do. And the amazing thing is just that memory that is going to stay with that precious child. You know, the fact that she had that already in her heart and in her mind from where the church had said that each week. And so she had that there, and you didn't see it at the moment when she was going through the big behaviors, when she was going through what she was dealing with, but it's there and it's still there. It's one of the reasons why church ministry means what it does to me is because when I was a child, my church was my safe place,
Mm,
and it was my happy place. And it was the one place in my world where I felt seen and felt
mm,
loved.
yeah. Yeah.
And I mean, and so here at my age, at
Mm.
I'm older now. I'm much older now, and there's a lot of things in my life that I remember and I don't remember,
Yeah.
but I still can see the faces of those
Mm,
teachers from even when I was in preschool, of how they showed God's love to me and how they
yeah.
cared for me and the things that they said and what they taught me. And truly, learning the word of God and having them pour into me is what saved me. I mean, it's
Yeah.
what, it was how I was able to survive the other things that were going
Mm,
on that none
mm,
of those people saw.
yeah.
But and so I think that that's why the ministry that you do is so important, because it helps us to see past those momentary outbursts or struggles that we have in the classroom
Right.
and be able to see something deeper, even if we never know what that child is going through or know what's happening behind those doors, to
Yeah.
know that we can show them God's love and we can teach them how God is with us. That's,
Yeah.
that's the most important thing that we can do. But it's
Yeah.
like you said, it's not always easy.
It's hard. Yeah. Right. It's not always glamorous. And there
No.
are times when we need to leave through the parking lot going, oh
Mhm.
my word, what a day.
Yes.
But what a gift to see that the word of God is hidden in this child's heart.
Right.
And it's
Yeah.
not just because they sat still and listened to the lesson and memorized the verse. They didn't
No.
do that.
No.
What they did experience, though, is that
Mhm.
God was with them through
Mhm.
this whole thing.
Right.
They experienced that through the actions and the grace of the
Mhm.
team around them.
Right.
So, yeah, it's beautiful to see what the people of God are capable of when we get out of our own way.
Right. Right.
When we can
Right.
just stop and say, I don't have to have ultimate control. I don't have to have
Right.
things look exactly the way I thought they would. I don't
No.
have to have the glory. I don't have the I don't have to have the attention. I don't have to
Mm-mm.
have it all the way that I planned for it to be.
Mm-mm.
But what I do get to do is point them to the Good Shepherd, who
Right.
will never leave them or forsake them. The Good
Mhm.
Shepherd who leads them to the good green grass and the cool, clear water and leads
Mhm.
them through the dark and dangerous places and
Mhm.
never, ever leaves them.
Right. Right.
That is what's important for us to do. So, yeah, when we work with kids from hard places, when we work with kids who are not from hard places but have big
Right.
emotions sometimes,
Right.
what a privilege. What a privilege to say,
Right.
I know the God who is with you
Yeah.
no matter what,
Mhm.
who will never leave you and is not scared of you. God's not
Right.
scared of you.
No.
You are welcome in God's arms.
Yeah. Oh, it's just such a wonderful blessing.
Mm.
Well, tell us about the resources that we can find through Reach Hurting Kids Institute.
Sure, sure. So Reach Hurting Kids Institute is an ecumenical team of many disciplines, right? So Dr. Robert Crosby is our executive director. He is a research psychologist, and he is invaluable in all the research that we do. Research is one of our key components. We want to make sure that all of the things we do are not just based on like, hey, I have a fun story and it worked for me. It is
Right.
research based, every piece of it. Lori Crosby is a licensed marriage and family therapist and play therapist. She works with kids who experience trauma and provides this beautiful voice of therapeutic approach to our team. I provide a pastoral voice of this is what children's pastors really need and the
Mhm.
practical pieces of the training. We have lots of members of the team that are more involved in the research side of things with Robert. And what we bring to the table is this workshop that is available for churches to use on their own time in their own way.
Mhm.
It is impractical to ask churches to pay a huge cost to bring in a specialist and speak about trauma informed ministry. As much as I
Right.
know Robert would love, Lori would, our whole team would love to
Right.
come and visit every single church. We would love that. We are finite beings and we can't do that.
Right.
So we've instead created a resource that you can use with your own team at your church that provides everything you need in order to train your volunteer team. We provide PowerPoints with embedded videos, lots of discussion points and activities within that, user's manual so you can be the one to speak through it. And it's as simple as reading through a script, or you can dive deep and do a bunch of research on it. But if you just have the time to read through the script, that's great. Stand and read. Participant workbooks and all of that included. So you can find all of the information about our workshop at reachhurtingkids.com/workshop. You can find more of our academic works. If you really love to read academic articles, feel free. They are all over the website. There's also a book that Robert and Lori wrote, like I mentioned before, of the research that they did in children's ministry. So this book is full of stories with names changed and identifying markers of churches changed. So this is Trauma-Informed Children's Ministry, a practical guide to reaching hurting kids, by Robert and Lori Crosby. And you can find that on Amazon. You can find it on Audible as well if you'd rather listen to it. Those are our resources. You can find us also at Kids Matter Conference. We'll be at CPC. We just love to connect with this community. And if anyone is interested in connecting with me specifically, or asking questions, or talking through any situation that's happening with your church, I would love nothing more than to have a conversation. So you can reach me at Kayla@reachhurtingkids.com.
That's awesome. Well, I'll have all of that information in the notes. Kayla, it's been so much fun talking to you today, and we just appreciate you coming and sharing with us so very much.
Oh, it has been my pleasure. Thank you so much, Val.
And just to all of our listeners, we thank you for taking your time with us today. We appreciate you so much. Please let us know if there's any way that we can minister to you, what we can do for you so that we can meet you where you are. We ask that you would like and subscribe and all the things, and we look forward to talking to you again soon. Bye-bye.